Live. So, all right.
All right.
Hello, everybody. Almost Shabbat Shalom. We got another day to go before Shabbat, but I am not Doug, and neither is Tim. Doug is having some technical difficulties, so I'm really hoping that he will be joining us pretty soon. But from my conversations with Tim over the past, I don't know, a couple of weeks, the very first time we talked, we started discussing this topic, and then we started doing biblical prophecy bunny trails all over the place. But tonight, our guest is Tim Cohen. He has written several books. He has several books that are still in the production phase from talking to him that he plans on releasing pretty soon. But the primary topic we're going to be discussing tonight, and as we always do, we will bunny trail. But the primary topic is going to be his book, Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, and how he teaches that he believes Prince Charles, former Prince of Wales, now King Charles of England, is the Antichrist. So in conversations with Tim, he has been forewarned that I'm not necessarily going to agree, but I will say this right now. What Tim presents in his teachings, I haven't read his book because I can't get it, but what Tim presents in his teachings and videos and things like things of that nature, the coat of arms, and we'll go over all this. And what really got me intrigued and my attention on Prince Charles, not that he wasn't already a person to be watched, but what really got my attention was when he presided over the Commonwealth Games in England. And so Tim's got a video that we're going to be watching that with and discussing other matters. So Tim, kind of like we talked about, I'm going to hush and shut up for like 10, 15-ish minutes and let you sort of take over. And I promise I'll zip it for about 10 to 15 minutes, okay? And then we'll start going back and forth, okay?
Okay, so folks, this is my first time using the particular streaming platform that I'm on. So if I'm a little confused and disjointed, just bear with me. I'm going to try to share my screen without completely botching it. And hopefully that'll work. And Scott, I'll rely on you to tell me if you're seeing what I expect.
Not seeing what I saw earlier. There you go. So I'm going to add that to the stream, and we will make it like that. There we go.
All right. So we'll start with this. This is the front cover of, well, it's a draft front cover of the second edition of the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea. And Scott, can you see my cursor where I'm pointing?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So in 1987, I asked God to show me who and what was being spoken of in Revelation chapter 13, which is that pretty bizarre imagery that describes a beast with feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion, and then a dragon who gives that beast his power, throne, and great authority. And at that point, having read through the New Testament more than once, a portion of the Old Testament, having become a believer in November of 1986, and then getting to that portion of Scripture in Revelation 13, I thought, well, you know, everything in Scripture appears to me to be literal. What is this talking about? So I asked God, and not long after that, quite soon after that, I had in my possession the coat of arms that you see here on the front cover of the Antichrist and Cup of Tea. I found it actually in a book in the cadet library at the United States Air Force Academy, which I was attending at the time. And on it, you see the literal imagery of Revelation 13 and Daniel 7. So I'll just go through a little bit of that. Beast with feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion here on what to you is the left side of the screen. It's called the Dexter supporter in heraldry. Normally it would be a lion or a lion leopard for England. And this is, of course, Charles, now King Charles III, his heraldic achievement or his official coat of arms, granted to him in July of 1969 when it was first formally unveiled to the world at his investiture as Prince of Wales. And that was the most widely viewed event in history at the time. So anyway, normally this would be a lion or a lion leopard for England. In the case of Charles' coat of arms, however, it's got proportions like a leopard's body, feet like the feet of a bear. And I will tell you on the graven coat of arms, a heraldic achievement that was hung kind of like cast iron in appearance, but actually formed of plaster and painted to look like cast iron, that was hung over the castle entrances to Caernarvon Castle and over the Queen's Gate, On the graven coat of arms, there were two versions that showed this beast, this dexter beast, and the claws actually were bear's claws on that. I'm showing that in the second edition of the Antichrist and Cup of Tea, this edition that you're looking at. That'll be in the book. But anyway, mouth like the mouth of a lion, body like the body of a leopard, feet like the feet of a bear. So it's like. In other words, we're talking about similes, things that evoke imagery. So it's not precisely the feet of a bear, precisely the body of a leopard, precisely the mouth of a lion necessarily. And then you see the red dragon here. This happens to be the same red dragon that's spoken of in Revelation 12 and 13, and in Revelation 12 explicitly identified as Satan and as the serpent who deceived Eve in the Garden of Eden. So this particular red dragon traces back to the standards of the Roman cohorts that occupied ancient Britannia and prior to that ancient Wales. And then going back before that even to the Roman cohorts occupying ancient Judea. So it is literally the red dragon of Revelation 12 and 13. And then you also have a unicorn on this coat of arms that's not unique to Charles in history, but it's unusual because it has human eyes. So if you look at the eyes on this, and there's a prominent unofficial version of his coat of arms also shown inside the book. But in both cases, it's got human eyes. And Charles refers to this as his little horn. So he's actually known as Unicorn. That's what he's called in the United States by our Secret Service when he travels here, or has been, still is, I presume. And then he was known by the call sign Red Dragon when he was flying choppers, helicopters for the Royal Navy and commanding a minesweeper in the past. So he went by the call sign Red Dragon. He's been known as Unicorn, and then he's got all this imagery on his coat of arms. So in Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, and let me bring it up here, there is a commandment. Actually, I probably have it up here. Yeah. There's a command to do a name calculation in verse 18 of Revelation 13. And what most Christians miss and have missed historically is there's a specific context to doing that calculation. It tells us in that verse, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. But also before that says it's the number of the beast. And there are two beasts in Revelation 13. One is traditionally thought to be the Antichrist. The second is traditionally thought to be the false prophet. The Antichrist, that beast arising out of the sea, the one for the false prophet arising out of the land. They have two completely different sets of imagery associated with them in that chapter. And then when you get to verse 18 in context, it's speaking of the first beast, the one that comes out of the sea. And it says, here is wisdom, let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. In other words, if that imagery isn't present for the man in question, the calculation itself is not valid. It doesn't matter how it turns out. So that's the first point. Charles is the only human being in the history of the world to actually literally have that imagery, and it happens to be on his heraldic achievement. His sons do not have it. Just to clarify that for you folks, if you think you find it in Wikipedia or something like that, Wikipedia is in error. William and Harry both have their own coats of arms at this point. Neither of them has this imagery. Second point is the system to do the calculation, which you see here displayed on the screen. This is a chart that's put together from the chart in my book. This is from the first edition of the Antichrist and the Cup of Tea, where you can see how they gave the calculations. But the first point to make is that the Greek text of Revelation 13:18 actually specifies the number 666 with three Greek letters. One letter for the number 600, a second letter for the number 60. That's 6 right there, pardon me. Second letter for the number 60. Third letter for the number 6 to get 666. In other words, the Greek text of Revelation 13 tells us the system we're supposed to use to do the calculation. And as it turns out, on that system, it's a sequential, not a phonetic system. On that system, as you transfer it sequentially to English and calculate Prince Charles of Wales, or Charles, Prince of Wales, the title by which he was known globally until very recently, it calculates to exactly 666. The exact same title in modern Israeli Hebrew, and Hebrew is the source of the original system that was transferred to the Greek text sequentially and then used in Revelation 13:18 to specify the number. The exact same title, Nasik Charles Mavoyles, in Hebrew works out as well to exactly 666. Mathematically, statistically speaking, that's effectively impossible. It can't ever happen. And we're talking about the name calculations alone. To have that same system with two completely different sets of numbers for the same title, a title as complicated as this one, Charles, Prince of Wales, work out to exactly 666. The odds are so far against that, you can basically call it impossible. But it's a fact. And what makes it so unique, of course, is that the calculation is done in the context of the actual presence of the imagery and on the biblical numbering system. So those facts alone make Charles the Antichrist scripturally of Revelation 13. In other words, the prophecy, verse 18, where it says to do the calculation in the context that imagery is now fulfilled, and it has been fulfilled since 1987. And in fact, there were a couple of people prior to me, one who had the English name calculation and a cropped off, partial version of the unofficial coat of arms that I show inside the book. And that was Monty Judah. And how they came up with that was quite interesting. A bunch of Martin Marietta engineers wrote a program, threw in a bunch of names of prominent people in the world, and one was spat out as 666. That was Prince Charles. Monty went to a local library in Colorado Springs at the time, found that unofficial coat of arms on the front cover of a book, only partially there, cut off, and proceeded from there. And he showed me that in 1987, shortly after I asked God to show me who and what was being spoken of in that chapter. So I'm going to revert from this imagery in a moment, but I just want you folks to catch this. There is one other point I'll have you look at here on this imagery for a moment. So this is the second edition, and the colors that you're seeing on your screen are CMYK, which is a typical color that would be used, color combination that would be used with an offset printer to professionally print books or that sort of thing. The actual coat of arms is CMYK, and when it's scanned, you can actually see there are additional colors in it. And I want you to notice the unicorn is not actually white or gray, it's pale green gray. And you can see the grayish hue to the unicorn, kind of like rotting human flesh. And that's significant because in Revelation chapter 6, under the fourth seal for the fourth horseman, and that's who the Antichrist actually is. In this case, the Antichrist will be over a global government for 3.5 years. The color of that horse is identified, it's usually translated in English as ashen or pale green or gray. But the meaning of the Greek text specifically is pale green gray, kind of like the color of rotting human flesh. And so I'm pointing this out because that is the precise coloration of the unicorn with human eyes on Charles' coat of arms. And in Daniel 7, the Antichrist, the same person who rules for 3.5 years in that chapter, is identified as the little horn of the eyes of man. Charles refers to this unicorn as his little horn, quote unquote. So I'm quoting him when I say that. And then, of course, I mentioned the call signs he's been known by and so forth. So with that all shown, I'll return so that you can see me, and then we'll continue the dialogue if I can figure out how to undo my screen sharing. There we go. Stop screen share. All right. You see me again? I'm not hearing you. Okay. Are you seeing me?
Because I was muted, I needed to mute myself, because if I don't mute myself, I'll interrupt you, even though I promised you I wouldn't. So
Okay,
maybe Doug can hear us and he can use his phone and at least get on with his phone, even if it won't be as good a production level. But yeah, again, everybody, I knew the comments would come, and certainly you're getting pushback, and I'm sure you're used to that. Getting pushback on and again, I like the fact that you agreed to come on and discuss this topic, because Doug doesn't believe that Charles is going to be the Antichrist necessarily. I'm of the opinion, I'm waiting and seeing, but there is, and again, I want to get into that. But what would you say? Would you say your primary basis? I guess it was what, since 1987, would be the Gematria and the coat of arms?
Well, that's where I started. I knew nothing about British royalty at the time, very little about history. History was the driest subject I could, imagine anywhere in the world,
Okay.
just about. So that's where I began. So in other words, I started researching from the top down. I didn't go and try to figure out who the Antichrist was. I just asked God to show me who and what was being spoken of in that chapter because of the strange imagery, and he did. And as I researched it, and of course at that time Charles was already, being called the most eligible bachelor in the world and was already known globally, all over the world, everywhere on the planet. And I didn't know much about him, but that was 1987. And I figured, well, we probably don't have that long since God has shown me who the Antichrist is. But, in the intervening years, as I researched it, and the first edition of the Antichrist and Captivity came out 11 years later in 1998. So it took that long to get the first edition done. As I researched it, I discovered that Charles is actually the number one globalist on the planet. And he has been since July 1969. This entire time he's been running the show. Even today, everything that is happening in the world, and I could mention a number of things like the Great Reset, the whole, carbon pollution, eco-fascist, climate emergency scare, all of it. The whole thing sits beneath Charles. It always has. Even the Mideast peace process. Since Shimon Peres, the London Agreement of 1987, you can formally, explicitly show that the entire false Mideast peace process with Israel to this day sits beneath Charles. And the fact that he's now king, folks, you need to understand that doesn't make any difference. He's already fulfilled the prophecy, in other words, in Revelation 13:18. I have already fulfilled it in terms of identifying who the Antichrist is. In other words, it makes zero difference at this point what happens with his title. The fact that William is now Prince William of Wales and Charles is now King Charles III doesn't matter. The prophecy is already fulfilled to identify who this individual is, who is going to be over global government, and that is Charles. So we could talk about some of the examples of how he's over everything happening in the world today, trace it. But literally the entire modern New World Order, global infrastructure, the whole system sits beneath Charles, and it has been since his investiture in July of 1969 as Prince of Wales before the world, which was the most widely viewed event in the history of the world at the time, an estimated television audience of 500 million plus. And he's been at the forefront of a number of the most viewed events in the history of the world since then, with the numbers just, increasing.
Real quick, and obviously right now I'm letting you more talk. This is nowhere near our phone conversation, as you know, but can you pull up the video clip? I would like the audience to see, and you'll probably have to mute it or lower the volume on your end so you can talk. And that would be the video clip that you were referring to. We're talking about the Commonwealth Games, the reason.
Before we do that, if you don't mind, Scott, I want to build this up a little bit more.
Go ahead.
In terms of what's happened in the intervening years. So the video clip that Scott is talking about, folks, is something that happened in July this year that was quite significant with regard to Charles before his mother died and he became King Charles III. But there have been a number of things that happened in the intervening years that are quite significant. So I want to trace a little bit of the history so that you can begin to grasp that what I'm saying is actually true. And then we'll show this clip for what happened this year. So historically, the United Nations came out of the League of Nations. The League of Nations itself came out of something known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or otherwise called Chatham House, in London. Charles has headed the Royal Institute of International Affairs since maybe July 1967 or 69, pardon me, but certainly the 1970s has been over it. The United Nations has something called the Global Security Lecture Series, and each year they deliver a global security lecture. It was initiated by Charles personally, and he personally delivered the first global security lecture at the United Nations in person. So the modern UN that we know about, that the world thinks about in terms of global governance typically actually goes back to the British monarchy. Charles has been over the entity that was responsible more than any other for its creation historically. Charles has stated that he wants to see a standing United Nations army with himself as its commander. He has stated that in his biographies. That's cited in the first edition of the Antichrist and Appeasing. The Kyoto Protocol which most people have heard of if you've heard about the COP talks, like COP 12, COP 14, COP 15, COP 21, this year COP 27. These are the United Nations climate accords that are happening now around the world each year. Those COP agreements go back to the Kyoto Protocol of Japan, to which the United States did not sign on. And the Kyoto Protocol itself goes back to something called the Rio Earth Summit of the early 1990s. Charles was personally credited by global leadership, including Al Gore, for the success of the Rio Earth Summit because he personally organized aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia, which was before it was decommissioned, meetings that were held by the major stakeholders of the Rio Earth Summit. He chaired those meetings, and because the Rio Earth Summit led to the first, climate accord, if you will, to which nations signed on, he was hailed for the success of that. In Brazil, a Brazilian state government in Tocantins, subsequently in the early 2000s, commissioned a statue to Charles. Now, this is years after the first edition of the AntiChrist and the Cup of Tea was published. So I'm going to show that statue here and tell you a little bit about that and then continue. All right. Do you see the statue?
Yes.
All right. So this statue was commissioned by the state governments of Tocantins. This is the miniature version that was handed to Charles and photographed by the BBC. That's actually a BBC photo taken from the early 2000s, 2002, I believe it was. And it could be 2003, but I believe it was 2002. There's a full-size version of it that, depending on what story you read and how you understand the measurement of a cubit biblically, the actual length of a biblical cubit could be argued to be 10 cubits in height. You can legitimately make that argument based upon the reports in the press on the height of the full-size version, which is identical to the statue, just much larger, versus what Scripture says about the measurement of a cubit. Now, why that's significant, the idea of 10 cubits for the height of the statue, the full-size version one, is that there were two angelic cherubim statues placed on either side of the Ark of the Covenant. So not the two small angels that people typically think of on the lid on the Ark of the Covenant, but statues on either side of it in the Holy of Holies. Historically, each of those angelic statues were 10 cubits in height. In other words, the statue, the full-size version of this that was commissioned to Charles, is ready-made height-wise to go into a newly constructed holy place on the Temple Mount in the future. Second point is that the statue has Charles' face on it, and he's standing atop massive human bodies dressed only in a loincloth. That is the official description of the statue. Additionally, on the base of it, it has the inscription, Savior of the World, British spelling, S-A-V-I-O-U-R, of the world. So this Brazilian state government, which commissioned the statue to Charles, was literally calling him the savior of the world, and they meant it in an environmental context because of the success of the Rio Earth Summit. So I pointed out in another interview earlier this year with Janie Duvall, and this is in the second edition as well of the AntiChrist and the Cup of Tea, that the root words of the Hebrew text of Daniel 9:27 describe this specific statue. I won't go into the details on that now. It's covered in the book. But I will say two things. One is that statues of Zeus by the Greeks and Jupiter by the Romans historically, the same false god in the pantheon of gods to both of those cultures, were typically dressed only in a loincloth or completely naked. Occasionally, they had wings, like we see on this statue. If you were to view this statue in the context of history, and the context of Charles being called Savior of the world, in the context of him as the foretold Antichrist, what it is effectively saying is that Charles is to be Zeus or Jupiter. Now, we know that the Antichrist at the start of the Great Tribulation is going to be possessed by Satan as the son of perdition. There are two sons of perdition in Scripture. One was Judas Iscariot, who was possessed by the devil right before he went to betray Christ for Christ to be crucified. The second is the Antichrist in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, who is likewise called the son of perdition. And we understand from Scripture, most theologians do, that the Antichrist is going to be possessed by the devil. And I would place the timing of that as being at the start of the Great Tribulation when he gains control over global governments. In other words, he's not possessed yet. He's going to be. So the significance of this whole explanation is this statue portraying Charles as Zeus or Jupiter historically, when he is possessed by the devil as the Antichrist sometime from now at the start of the Great Tribulation, it will effectively be like the devil inside of Charles when he's possessed, showing himself, that he's God, if you will, this false God, that he's God when this statue is sitting upon the Temple Mount, or showing himself that he's Zeus or Jupiter, that kind of thing. So Charles has...
Hold on. Are you equating him with the beast then? Because the first beast is it says the beast that arises from the abyss. And then I believe it talks about it's this beast that kills the two witnesses. So, and again, at the end of Revelation, or towards the very end, the beast and the false prophet, the second beast, are thrown into the abyss. Satan, it's almost like Satan has read the book and knows the plan, and he's actually not even going to be the beast. Therefore, he gets locked away in the abyss for 1,000 years. So again, I'm not discounting that this entity is going to be the son of perdition, if you will. And I know where you're getting that from, because it does say Satan possessed Judas Iscariot. But at the same point in time, it's the beast it certainly seems to me to be a completely different entity other than the dragon and Satan, because it's the dragon that empowers the beast.
So there are two beasts in Revelation 13 explicitly called beasts. The one that rises out of the sea, which has that imagery that's on Charles' coat of arms. The beast of feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion, to whom the dragon gives his power, throne, and great authority. Prior chapter, Revelation 12, we see that dragon is the fiery red dragon, identified as Satan. The second beast arises out of the land in Revelation 13. Arises out of the land, has two horns like a lamb, and speaks like a dragon. So there are two different beasts in Revelation chapter 13, one out of the sea, one out of the land. Christians have typically looked at that second one, a lot of Christians have, and said, well, the two horns may be representing the East-West division in the Roman Empire historically. Maybe it's talking about Rome's Pope as the false prophet. There have been different arguments on that. Now, I'm not taking a dogmatic position.
Let me read those passages for you again. Let me read these passages. Revelation 11:7. When they, and this was referring to the two witnesses, have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. Revelation 17:8. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. So again, one of the reasons, and you know this from our conversation, Tim, is this entity, this beast, he's in the abyss right now.
We're talking apples and oranges. It says he'll go into perdition. Okay, so when it says he'll go into destruction, that's the same Greek word that's used for perdition, of the son of perdition.
Okay.
So you have the Antichrist identified as the son of perdition. And I'm not seeing you. Hopefully you're still there and hearing me. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Yeah. And then with the passage you're citing, it says that the beast comes up out of the abyss, goes into perdition. So it suggests potentially possession. In other words, the language there does. Possesses, in other words, the son of perdition. But the word perdition means destruction, but it's a unique word that's used of Judas. It's used of the foretold Antichrist in 2 Thessalonians 2. And then the passage you're citing is talking about a beast that comes out of the abyss that goes into perdition. We also know in Revelation 16 that right before the gathering for Armageddon, there'll be three unclean spirits that come out of the mouth, respectively, of the dragon, Satan, out of the mouth of the Antichrist, and out of the mouth of the false prophets. In other words,
can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I'm so glad to be here. Tim, it's interesting. I think you're making some good points about the word perdition. Can you maybe, I don't know if I missed it, but how does that refer to King Charles? I'm missing the
It doesn't
connection there.
specific. I think it's a reference probably to Satan. It's certainly a reference to an unclean spirit, probably a fallen angel. So,
Well,
Satan
the whole
is the
perdition
top
thing
fallen
and
angel.
the beast and the perdition, son of perdition, you think that's Satan, or do you think that is the beast
son
or
of perdition
the
is the
Antichrist?
So it's like saying Charles' father spiritually is the devil, the son of perdition.
Do you believe that?
Not physically, no. Spiritually, I mean, he's a servant of the devil. When he's possessed by the devil, he is spiritually the son of perdition. And he does refer to his father in the context of the red dragon in a quote, and I provided that quote to Scott at his investiture in July of 1969, which the whole world, could see. It was his mother who put the coronet on his head. It was his mother who gave him the vestments of the investiture, like the sword, the ring, the ermine mantle, the coronet on his head, some other things like called the letters patent, a series of titles and other jargon. She gave him all of that at his investiture, and then people attending gave some of that, but she personally put the coronet on his head to crown him Prince of Wales, and he was facing the red dragon through her directly when the coronet was put on his head behind her back. And then behind his back on the opposite castle wall, and this was a huge open-air castle, were more huge red dragon banners. So his mother, the queen, also was facing the red dragon. They both were. And then the backrest of the throne from which she stood up to put the coronet on his head, which he was facing directly through her, had the same dragon, the dragon of Wales, at that time adopted in 1953 as the national symbol of Wales, that same red dragon, had that engraved in gray Welsh slate on the backrest. So Charles was facing it. She was facing it. She put the coronet on his head. But Charles was later quoted by one of his most prominent biographers, Anthony Holden, as saying that it was his father who put the coronet on his head, that it was his father who presented him to the Welsh people, that it was his father who did all these things. He said father, and he said he twice. Charles did. But everybody could see it was his mother who did that. That's a pretty strange mistake for a biographer to make in the same couple of sentences 3 times consecutively. In other words, he didn't quote it as father and then say she, or quote it as mother and then say he. It was father, he. So who was Charles talking about? So I would suggest that he was referring to the devil, literally. And I have reason to believe, and it's documented in the book, that Charles has known from a young age who he is, that he is intended to be the Antichrist, and that his mother has known that. And a lot of people think his mother died, as a Christian. You hear that from Billy Graham, who's deceased, now from Franklin Graham, his son. You hear it all over in the United Kingdom. The truth is she never publicly rebuked Charles for his spiritual beliefs because she believed exactly as he did. And I include photos in the second edition of the book with her having her own event at Caernarvon Castle years before his investiture in July 1969. And at her event, the same red dragon was the central symbol. It was on the order of service. She was facing it. And then even prior to that, when she was princess still, before she became queen, she had a private event in Wales, in a forest, a druidic event under the Gorsedd Druids. And their primary symbol is that same red dragon. It's on their banner, and she was facing that.
That red dragon goes all the way back to the ancient Babylonians, right? And back ancient Sumerians, in fact. Could it be that the Court of Wales simply adopted that for whatever reason, and maybe there are a lot of places that are using that same symbol? I mean, I show it in my book that is something that is very ancient. So I'm just wondering if, just having that red dragon, it's interesting. I look for necessary things and then sufficient, right? So you have necessary ingredients and you have sufficient ingredients. I see some interesting things. I'm just wondering. And then we have a few questions I want to get to, but Scott, you had something.
Yeah, I was going to say to the little ceremony that was freaky, and it kind of goes to your corrupting the image, was the one recently where the queen, shortly before she passed away, pressed the little button and you had the triple helix DNA leading right to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I mean, the symbolism that's been coming, I guess, out of the crown, especially just in the past year or two.
Mm-hmm.
I told Tim this. I'm going to test everything. We're having Maria on next week to talk about her, what she sees in Trump. I'm just, if we're at the end of this age, I'm watching everybody. Anybody that's not that if Charles isn't the, I don't like to say the word. If Charles is a player in this, if we're at the end of this age, assuming he doesn't die, I think a lot of world leaders, bankers, political leaders, et cetera, are players in this overall game. If and I say game, but in this unfolding at the end of the age, and I will say this to Tim again. You can't deny the coat of arms. I mean, it's like whoever. I'm not saying Charles drew it up or whatever, but you cannot deny the symbolism matches Daniel 7 and matches Revelation 13 as far as that beast and that amalgamation between the first three and the final. Now, I don't think, obviously, I think it's a both and. I don't think it's just a man. I think it also is symbolic of nations and kingdoms.
Well, let me speak to that. So you're correct on that. Christians have looked at that historically and thought that it was metaphorical or metaphysical because there's no creature like that in nature. And more recently, even I had to ask, could it be some chimeric hybrid when I was first reading it, in Scripture, something out of science fiction made real. Some unnatural creature that's not supposed to exist through genetic engineering. But historically, all those symbols on the coat of arms, and let me just bring it up. I'll walk us through it really quickly here to show it so the audience can see exactly what we're talking about here. Okay. So this Dexter beast, which is normally a lion or lion leopard for England, but in the case of Charles is a lion leopard bear, chimera, normally represents England. This unicorn normally has a round eye socket, no visible sclera or eye white, not normally V-shaped. In the case of Charles' coat of arms, it is literally a human eye. And you can see that in the official, this coat of arms, as well as unofficial versions of his heraldic achievement, his little horn with the eyes of a man. That represents Scotland, historically, the unicorn does. The red dragon was adopted in 1953 as the national symbol of Wales, though Wales has long used it. And to your point, Doug, the red dragon has been used all over the world, particularly by Asians. For example, you see the Chinese version of the red dragon. You see it in ancient Asian mythology. You see it in other venues. But what's unique about this version on Charles' coat of arms is it actually traces to the Roman cohorts that occupied ancient Wales, and then it came into ancient Britain's heraldic devices. So the red dragon has been seen before on royal coats of arms, but it's been several centuries since it was last on one. I believe it was a Tudor coat of arms in the past. Very rare, hardly ever. And this is the first time in quite a few centuries that it's been shown on a royal coat of arms. But this is the red dragon that traces back to the Roman courts occupying ancient Britannia and then ancient Wales. And then before that, to the Roman cohorts occupying, ancient Judea. Let me get back to that. So you got Scotland, Wales, England, and then this harp here on the royal shield represents Ireland. So you have the coronations, in other words, of the United Kingdom, and then this other creature here in the opposite quarter to the harp, also on the royal shield, is known as the Red Lion of Scotland. These six on the royal shield, what would normally be lions or lion leopards for England, and in Scripture they're called the lions of Tarshish. Tarshish has been argued historically to be either Gibraltar or England. In this case, it's actually England. So Tarshish is actually England, in other words. I'm making that argument. But there are six on the royal shield, and then over the center are four more, and this is the shield of Wales. And it's here because Charles became Prince of Wales. So there are 10 total between these two shields in the center of the coat of arms. And the unique thing about all these is they're actually all lion leopard bears. That's not typical on these coats of arms. They're normally lions or lion leopards, like this Dexter beast over here. Now, the other point I'll make is you see these 3 descending bars around the necks of these beasts, these 3 here around the neck of the unicorn, the same 3 around the neck of the red dragon, same 3 around the neck of the beast, the feet like a bear, body like a leopard, mouth like a lion. And then notice here in the center of the coat of arms, there's an overall head, this gold helm at the top center of the coat of arms. This is known as the sovereign helm. It's always been on Charles' coat of arms, and that is very meaningful, and I'll say why in a moment. But right beneath it, you have that same set of 3 bars. The third one, the middle one, is obscured by this crown and this shield for Wales right beneath it. These 3 bars on this band is known as the label of the eldest son in heraldry. That's what it's actually called. In other words, they explicitly represent Charles. And what that means is this unicorn not only represents Scotland, it specifically represents Charles in heraldry. This red dragon not only represents Wales, and as is called Satan in Scripture, it explicitly represents Charles on this heraldic coat of arms. This lion, leopard, bear beast not only represents England, normally is a lion or lion leopard, but it explicitly represents Charles. And then this overall coat of arms is a corporate beast having its own head or helm in heraldry. It's viewed in a occult fashion, metaphysical, metaphorical, occult fashion in heraldry as a corporate beast with its own head. Right beneath it, you have that same label of the eldest son. And what that is telling us is that even though you've got individual nations of the United Kingdom represented here over the British Empire historically, now over the British Commonwealth, corporately, this whole thing explicitly represents Charles. And because that is around the neck of the red dragon, Scott, it is also implying that the devil is going to possess Charles, is going to become Charles, if you will, at some point. So what that means is that, yes, the imagery does represent nations. It represents, in fact, the core of the United Kingdom. And those 10 lion, leopard, bear beasts, called the lions of Tarshish historically, can be viewed as the offspring. So they're encompassing, if you will, the United States, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, all those nations that directly came from the United Kingdom historically. All that is tied in. And so...
Question for you, Tim, and
Yes.
I think obviously we're not there yet. So the Brian, who's a regular viewer, dragon and beast both have 7 heads and 10 horns. How do you reconcile this with the coat of arms? Or I think I gathered this from our conversation that you believe there will be something yet future in which Charles will subdue 3 other kings, perhaps, or maybe I'm getting that mixed up.
No, you're not mixed up. Both of those things are true. In fact, the imagery that is it Brian? Is that what his name?
Yeah, it was Brian.
The imagery he asked about is actually also on the coat of arms. I didn't point it out, but let me just quickly do so. And then I'll answer your question about how Charles actually, I think, is going to gain control over a global government that isn't yet constituted, but can be constituted very, very quickly at this point. So there's there are actually several other unique things about this.
We've got a few more. We've got a few more questions.
Well, he was answering that question.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I'm answering that question. So you've got 7 heads that are visible here. Notice I pointed out these 10 lion, leopard, bears in the center of the heraldic achievement or coat of arms. Of these 10, only 7 have their heads visible, unobscured. And I'll just point to them. That's 1 at the bottom right. There are 4 here in the center. The heads are not obscured. There are 2 more where you can see the heads, the bottom left one here, and then the top left one here. So there's 7 where you can see the heads. 3 of them are obscured. And then you've got this overall helm, coat of arms, the helm, which is the sovereign helm. You'll notice there are 3 elephant tusk-shaped bars across this helm, 7 of them, pardon me, elephant tusk-shaped bars. Now, when we talk about a horn biblically, it can be shaped 3 different ways. Like this conical horn atop the unicorn's head, that's a horn. Like these elephant tusk-like bars, those are also horns biblically. Like these 3 uprooted ones, in other words, inverted, they go down shaped a little bit like chemistry flasks, vials, but attached to this band at the base, this label of the eldest son, where there are 3 descending. So in other words, in the center of this coat of arms, there are 10 horns. There are the 7 on the helm. There are the 3 that are plucked up by the roots, in other words, inverted on the label of the eldest son. There are also 10 heads in the center, 3 of which are obscured. So in other words, the people who made this coat of arms, it's very intricate, but the imagery is represented. Now, separately, what does that mean in terms of how the Antichrist actually comes to power? So Daniel 7 says there are 10 horns representing 10 rulers or princes or kings, however we want to interpret it, 10 rulers in Daniel 7. The little horn with the eyes of a man comes up among them. So he effectively becomes the 11th among 10 others. 3 of the 10 are plucked up by the roots. So a lot of Christians look at that and they think, well, now the Antichrist is going to be the 8th among 7, and the 3 that are plucked up by the roots just disappear from the scene. They're conquered, or they go away, or they just disappear. And now he's the 8th among 7. We know that is not correct by looking at Revelation 17 and 18, for example. What we see in those chapters is that in the same hour that harlot, that city, Mystery Babylon, that harlot that rides this beast, in the same hour that she's burned with fire, which is all the way at the end of the tribulation week around the time of Armageddon, in that same hour, there are still 10 kings. There aren't 7 under the Antichrist. There are 10. So the fact that there are still 10 at the end, but 3.5 years before that, when he's about to start the Antichrist is about to start his global rule over this global government that lasts for 3.5 years. So he's plucking up 3 by the roots at the beginning of that 3.5 year period of the Great Tribulation. At the end of the Great Tribulation, in that last hour or so, when that harlot is burned with fire, there's still 10 kings. So what that tells us is that the 3 which are plucked up by the roots, they don't go away. They somehow come under the direct authority of the Antichrist. In other words, they become like his vassals. So another thing that we can notice about the 10 from the book of Daniel is that earlier in the book, they're identified as 10 toes. So 5 toes on each of 2 legs. And those 2 legs are historically understood as the east-west division in the Roman Empire. So you've got the gold head at the top of this statue in Daniel chapter 2, identified by Daniel later as Babylon, Babylonia. And then you've got other kingdoms, empires that descend from it historically, going through the Greek or Medo-Persian Empire, then the Greek, then down to the Roman and so forth. And then the split in the Roman Empire on those 2 legs, and then 10 toes, 5 on each of those 2 legs. So what it's really telling us is that 5 of the 10 are from the east, 5 from the west, as we might think historically of the east-west division in the Roman Empire. But now, since it's going to be a global government, we're talking about the east-west division in the world, because that global government is going to be over the world. And 3 of the 10 become the vassals, if you will, of the little horn with the eyes of man under his direct authority. So he's the 8th among 7, but he's also still the 11th among 10. So how does that work out? So I presented a scenario which I still think is the most likely one, in the first edition of the Antichrist and Capiti. And that is that the United Nations Security Council, which currently has 5 permanent members, there are 5 members who never rotate off or on to the council. They're always on it, and they have veto rights. That council would be expanded to 10 permanent members who have veto rights, with 3 of the 10 being from the European Union, and 5 of the 10 being from the East and 5 from the West, as we think of the East-West division in the world. Now, since before I first, looked at Charles as the Antichrist in 1987, to this day, every year, 2 or 3 articles come out from the United Nations talking about reforming the UN Security Council to be more representative, ostensibly of the nations of the world today. In other words, no longer to just be these nations that came out of World War II. Cold War adversaries that kind of balanced each other on the council, these 5 powerful nations.
To that point, Tim, I mean, a lot of younger people don't even realize that these nations called Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, did not exist prior to Britain and France and America defeating the Ottoman Empire and dividing them up. I mean, a lot of people, obviously the three of us know this, but yeah, it's like France and England got together and drew lines in the sand to even create these nations. They're not, I guess what they would call historically, they're not necessarily nations because they've always been up under one empire or the other for centuries, decades?
So there are 3 natural nations in the Middle East: Israel, Egypt, and Iran. If you want to call Iran, Persia, Medo-Persia.
The Kurds.
If you want to call them a natural nation in the Middle East rather than out of it, those would be the 3 natural nations.
Well, you had
those are also the.
You had the Medes. It was a Medo-Persian Empire. I personally believe that the Kurds are the descendants of the
Yeah, I'm referring to nations that are there today. That were there historically before England and France did what they did. So you're exactly right. They carved up the Ottoman Empire between them, what was the Ottoman Empire previously, and other territory there, and they divided it up and gave us, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, Yemen, Lebanon, Jordan, etc. And of course, Israel in smaller boundaries, expanded a little bit at a time since Israel's been attacked since 1948. But yes, so most of those nations that are over there are not the historical nations, but they're in the territory of the historical nations, and they are by and large the ethnicities of those historical nations. So, but back to my point, just to point out, the 5 permanent nations of the UN Security Council are currently the United States, Russia, which took over for the Soviet Union after it broke up, China, England, and France. Those 5. They have every 2 or 3 years at the UN talked about reforming the council to make it more representative, having more permanent members. The most common suggestion that comes up, and there are other suggestions, but the most common one is to expand it to 10 permanent members. They've already decided who 2 of the new members will be. They decided this decades ago, so long ago, in fact, that I identified who they are in the first edition of the Antichrist and the Cup of Tea in 1998. And those are Germany and Japan. So they will be 2 of the new nations when it's expanded. They've debated among 5 primary nations who the other 3 would be between Brazil, India, Mexico, Egypt, and Italy. Those are the 5 other primary ones that they're debating for the other 3 besides Japan and Germany. But whoever they end up being, if Germany gets added as one of the new 5, you'll end up having Germany, France, and England as being among the 10 permanent nations. And historically, the British monarchy is the monarchy of all 3 of those nations besides Greece. They're genealogically, Charles descends from practically every royal house on the planet of any note historically, including the Roman emperors, the ancient pharaohs of Egypt, the Assyrian and Babylonian kings, every monarchy in Europe, etc. He is, in a very literal sense, prince of this world, genealogically speaking. So that being said, though, the nearest genealogies are Germany, France, England, and Greece.
Yeah, they're all married. I mean, just look at them.
Yeah, well, yeah, a lot of that.
Charles, as some other people pointed out, Tim, Charles ain't the most suave-looking guy with all the intermarriage and everything going on. So, but hey, let's get to that video real quick. I think Doug is going to have to cut it off earlier than what I was planning. But yeah, let's definitely let's show that to the audience if they haven't seen it.
Yeah.
All right. So have you seen the video, Doug?
I think I saw it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. The whole thing or just the segment that was put out on Janie Duvall's?
Just a segment.
Program?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to show a little bit different portion of that. and
Great.
point some things out here. So let me just set this up for the audience a little bit. Apart from the Global Olympics, the largest international set of games in the world, which also occurs every 4 years and has now for several decades. It happened throughout the reign of Queen Elizabeth II up until this year, every 4 years or so. And these are called the Commonwealth Games. So they are occupying basically roughly a third of the world's population today. The games this year, which were held in Birmingham, England, in Alexander Stadium, had 72 nations and territories participating. So over 50 nations, pardon me, of the Commonwealth. I think, I could have this wrong, but I think there are 56 nations in the Commonwealth now. When the first edition of my book was written, I think it was 53 when the first edition was published. So now I think they're 56, but they had 72 nations and territories, and of course all the nations of the Commonwealth participating in this event. Charles personally opened and oversaw the entire event. And I'll show you a photo of that before I show this clip, just to set up some context for what occurred at the event. There we go.
I'll let you control
Actually,
it, Doug.
I want this right here. Okay.
That's a good picture, Tim.
Oh, thank you. Back when I was a little less gray and a little trimmer.
Yeah, that's obviously.
But, you know, we can work on it. I have my aspirations. So there we go.
We all get new bodies.
All right. So this is Birmingham 2022. This is actually Charles reading a scroll, piece of paper that came out of this. They call it a baton, though it looks a bit like a torch right here to the left of him, but we see it to the right on our screen. So the top of this thing opens, and this lady over here who was overseeing the games, you know, below Charles, the dame of the games, if you will, she opened this thing, pulled out the scroll, handed it to Charles, and it's actually a message from his mother, which traveled around the world from the period of the prior Commonwealth Games to this one this year, traveled across all of the nations of the Commonwealth and all of the participating territories to this game. And it was actually carried into the game by, I call them sexual Satanists, but in this case, a homosexual, who handed it to this dame, or well, handed it to another athlete, who handed it to this dame, who then pulled out the scroll, handed it to Charles, where he's reading a message from his mother effectively to bless and open the concluding portion, the portion I'm going to show, to open the concluding portion of the games, this set of games. But he was there the entire time, and he oversaw the whole thing for hours prior to him reading this. Now, what I want to show here is this is the mascot of the games. This is the same bull.
Oh, rainbow flag. Not a rainbow flag.
You know, actually, these are LGBTQIA plus whatever people behind this mascot. And the mascot was designed to have those colors and specifically to uphold to the British Commonwealth sexual Satanism. You know, and many of the nations in the Commonwealth, including the Muslim ones, they reject that. And so this was kind of shoved into their faces. And this is you know, they turned it into a toy also. And I'm going to show this. This is the mascot presented at the game. So the athletes, when they medaled at this game, they actually got a little miniature stuffed version of it. He's holding one right here. You can see this gold medalist from England. He's holding one and showing it off. It's this same bull. It's meant to represent this Baal Molech bull. So at the games, they had this 10-meter high, not 10 cubits, 10 meters high, huge mechanical bull with this woman, Stella. Her name's Stella for stellar, riding it. And she's named after this, well, they named it Stellar, but at the beginning of the games, when it opened, there's this exploding star beyond Saturn outside our solar system or in it, I don't know, but beyond Saturn, they show this in CGI as the games open on the screens, and then they showed it when the BBC was broadcasting this exploding star beyond Earth, beyond Saturn, and these shards, which all these people are, that look like lights, these diamond-shaped shards, they're supposed to have fallen to Earth from this exploding white star elsewhere in our solar system and landed in the Commonwealth nations, picked up by these people who are called dreamers, they're New Agers, who at this point in the ceremony have encircled this bowl after it's come on to the center of the stadium. They've encircled it and they've bowed down to it already multiple times by the time this photo is taken. Bowed down to it, worshiping the thing multiple times. And Stella wasn't originally riding it. Now she is the woman riding the beast. And anyway, these shards are part of this Luciferian star. And I want you to see that. That's why I'm pointing this out here. We're going to come back to this. And so this was an actual worship ceremony. And the whole British Commonwealth, roughly a third of the world's population and whoever else was watching this, internationally, and the whole stadium audience, tens of thousands of people, everybody was actually invited to participate in this ceremony as it began. And here's another photo of the same thing. Notice that Stella atop the bowl has her arm extended horizontally. She's actually moving that shard, which she's holding, her own shard that she, ostensibly obtained from the pieces that fell to the earth. She's waving it to the audience, basically inviting the audience, and she's moving it in all directions, horizontally and vertically. If you watch the video portion of it, she's inviting the audience to participate in this worship. And you've got three groups of people encircling the bowl. You've got the dreamers, who are the ones holding the shards. Immediately surrounding the bowl, you've got these moppish-looking women who were slaves, effectively, but have been released, if you will, simultaneously with this bowl, freed, if you will. And then you've got these very colorful people who are dancers, who have paraded around the bowl, and actually a number of them are some of the athletes from the games dressed this way. But they are worshiping this bowl, and all of them have bowed down multiple times around the bowl. At this point in the ceremony, it's still light out. It's not dark at night overhead yet. This ceremony lasted for hours. Here's another image of the same thing. I'm showing this one because what I want you to notice is what's happening atop the bowl's head. So look at the head here. You'll notice the head looks similar. And here it's different. You'll notice there's a plate on top of the head of the bowl between the horns. There are a bunch of words and names inscribed on that plate, which I've documented in the second edition, The AntiChrist and a Cup of Tea. But basically, it's a symbol of enslavement to an extent, of the former slave days, if you will, because they're portraying this bowl being freed at the beginning of the events, partially freed, breaking free from chains. Now the plate is gone. And this is what happens in between. You see these two angelic figures at the very top of the plate lifting it off of the head of the bowl? They actually had these two figures coming on wires as if they were angels, flying in to the stadium from above to the head of the bowl, landing on it, and then lifting off that plate. And that plate is then flown and literally set at the base of the Tower of Babel. And there was an actual mock Tower of Babel at this event that the bull was facing throughout most of the ceremony. And I'm going to show that here in the video clip. So with all that shown, let's go to the video clip now. Oh boy, that's a bit weird. All right, let me bring this up. There we go. Are you all seeing this now on your screen?
Yes, I haven't started playing yet, but yes.
Okay.
By everybody, by the way, that's the Tower of Babel being symbolized.
Yes, and it's only partially erected. Atop it is a house, and that's actually Stella's house. They flew these houses into the stadium at the beginning of the ceremony. Literally, they raptured these dreamers from all over the Commonwealth in their homes with the crystals that they'd found. So they found these crystals around the Commonwealth. They went into their homes. All of a sudden, they experienced anti-gravity effects. The homes were literally uprooted from the ground and flown across the Commonwealth, across forests and lakes and oceans and so forth, to over the stadium, and then landed in the stadium. And at the top of the tower here is Stella's house, the same woman who rode the beast. So she came out of it earlier. And right beneath the doorway to that house is Stella at the second level of the tower. They're actually portraying the tower itself being erected here again, being built. So I'm going to show that. I'm going to narrate through parts of this as we see the video. You're going to see the tower rising through some of this and then other imagery. The segment here is about 6 minutes long, a little over 5 minutes. And so I'm going to talk about what we're seeing here. So this guy here is a bard. So the bards are typically performers, but the druids also have bards, including the Gorsed druids. So these guys are connected to druidry, as well as performance, actors and actresses, bards. But this bard also has one of these crystals that the dreamers found. Up at the top, you can't really tell, but Stella's got hers in her hand. She's at the very top. She's cut off on the screen, but we'll see what they all do with these crystals here in a moment. He's raising it up, and I want to let you hear the audio here just briefly to hear what he is saying, if it'll let me do that. There we go. Sorry, I want to get the quality of the video, what it should be.
I don't know if we're going to hear the sound.
Are you not hearing the sound right now?
No.
Okay, then I'll just describe it. They're talking about a time of new beginnings. But watch what they do with these shards. You can see Stella up top. She's got her shard in hand. This bard down below has a shard. All these other dreamers are surrounding the base of the tower. There are 71 of them, apart from Stella. She's the 72nd. Watch what they do with these shards. And by the way, again, these are supposed to be pieces of that star, that bright white star that blew up in the heavens and descended to the earth at the beginning of this whole thing. So this is a New Age ceremony where they're worshiping literally a Luciferian kind of a light. And that's what these shards represent to these people. And they do actually explicitly call this the Tower of Babel twice in the ceremony. BBC even states it's the Tower of Babel. That's what it represents. All right, so they're going to take those shards and they're going to literally stick them into the sides of the tower. Watch what they do with this. And now they're going to float up through the tower as they enter these sides of it. All the dreamers are going to stick their shards into the side. And you'll notice the tower is rising. It's like it's being built as this is happening, ascending to the heavens. So all these shards are coalescing. They're recombining.
Light.
They're becoming that star that had formerly exploded and descended to the earth. And there it is atop the tower. In other words, it's representing Lucifer, or the day star, reborn in a sense. Notice all the houses up top here. Kind of like the rapture A second stage, if you will, is what they're trying to portray. But these houses are going to disappear. I think that this is done with some kind of holographic imagery. Now here's the bull, this Baal Molech bull. It's rising up on its two front legs. It's facing the tower. Watch what happens between its chest and that star over the tower. And also notice the flags all around the base of the bull. These are the flags of the 72 nations and territories. They've literally set their flags before it, you know, as pagans would set their idols before the idol, you know, the idols of their gods before the God they're worshiping, if you will, historically. So in other words, they're acknowledging these 72 nations and territories, whether they realize it or not. They're acknowledging the Baal Molech bull here as a godlike figure. Now watch what occurs here. Okay. So there's actually a cluster of 6 beams of light here that are being transmitted between the chest of this bull and the all-seeing eye. We're going to see that more clearly in a moment. One of these beams is in a stick figure type pattern, kind of like a humanoid figure, this center bottom one right here that I'm circling with a mouse. And then we're going to see that beam, you know, strike this ball right here. So you can see it across the smoke. It's glittering between the all-seeing eye atop the tower and the chest of the bull. You can see it glimmering. Now, notice what's happening at the base of the tower here. You're actually looking at a giant coiled serpent being portrayed inside of the tower, kind of like springing up toward the head at the top, which is the Luciferian all-seeing eye. We'll see that a little more clearly here. You're actually looking at the scales of the snake you were. So now they've dissolved those houses to say, welcome to Birmingham, some sort of holographic thing. But you'll notice the snake, the body of it is still coiled and writhing through the tower beneath the head here at the top, which is the Luciferian all-seeing eye, if you will. And the beam of light is still going between the chest of the bull and that ball over the tower. You can see it better at times when there's more smoke in the stadium, and we'll see that here in a moment when it's more obvious. Like right now, the beams are becoming a little bit more evident because of the smoke. All right, now catch what happened here. And this is why I'm showing this. Did you notice that the ball disappeared from over the tower? It's gone all of a sudden.
Yes, I was muted. Yeah. Yes.
All right. I want you to see the ball has just disappeared over the tower. Watch what has appeared in its place over the bull. This is like a beating heart, if you will. And even the music is kind of matching that beat like a heartbeat over the top of the bull while this is happening. It's synchronized. So basically, they're symbolizing Lucifer going right over the top of the bull. So migrating from the top of the tower to being over the top of that bull. And we're going to see this from the ground level here in a moment. And then I'm going to show you what they're actually suggesting by it. All right. You see this pattern over the top of the bull?
Yep.
Converging. Okay. That was very intentional, and I might be the only person in the world at this point, other than people who, well, I might be the only one, other than people whom I've mentioned it, I don't know, who's noticed this, but that pattern is designed intentionally to mimic the Battle of Los Angeles. So this is the famous Battle of Los Angeles from the 1940s, February of, I think it was 42, I'd have to look. Yeah, February 26, 1942. Says right here in the title. I think it was actually 25th. But either way, February of 1942, there was an anti-gravity craft, a saucer that came in, tracked on radar, off the coast of California, over Los Angeles, and stopped. It hovered right here, and artillery, anti-aircraft guns fired for a lengthy period of time on this object that was glowing, that was overhead, and they couldn't down it. This was both filmed and photographed by the press. This segment here from YouTube actually includes the film footage, and it also shows the photograph. So this is the photograph. This is another photograph from the film footage. But what they're basically doing with that imagery over the bowl, and this imagery is a very close match to what they've done here. So if we look at this as they draw in closer, to give us a bigger view of it, it gets even closer to matching that imagery of the Battle of Los Angeles. So Duran Duran was singing the music here at the event, and it had begun. The music had at the point where this was occurring. And there's a song that attends this portion of the ceremony, and the song has to do with aliens coming down from above, as if there was an alien god. So what they're basically suggesting here is Lucifer migrating from atop the tower to over the bowl, and at the same time implying or intimating that Lucifer is an alien, like the aliens did it kind of thing. So I just thought that's an interesting hidden aspect to the ceremony worth highlighting. And then you're going to see this thing over the bowl migrate to go back to being atop the tower. And we'll see what happens after that. And again, notice the flags. They're still all around the bowl. All these people who are surrounding the bowl now, it's not just the worshipers we saw earlier. It's also all the teams. The athletes who didn't leave, by this point, who decided to participate in the parade around the bowl. All the teams literally encircled the bowl. They walked around the track almost 360 degrees. And then when they were close to where they'd, entered the arena to walk around the track, they then entered into the inner area of the track, into the field area directly around the bowl, and took up positions all around the bowl. And that's what you're seeing, the athletes representing the nations in addition to their flags.
Hey, Tim, do you show on this one, or maybe it was earlier, and I think it might have been earlier in the ceremony. This is what it really intrigued me, is you've got the 72 nations. You have the lady, Stella, or whatever her name was. She's obviously the woman that rides the beast. And then you had the 70 sort of surrounding the bull, and you had one prominent nation called out front and center. And and again, I didn't see this. We talked about it. You pointed it out to me, but I immediately made the connection all the way back to the Tower of Babel when there were 70 nations. And then obviously God then calls Abraham out of the nations to be his nation, which we later know becomes Israel 3 generations later, and then through his sons. And he still wants to restore this nation of Israel. And I think you pointed out, that 71st nation represents that even Israel, and anybody listening that hasn't listened to myself and Doug long enough, when we say Israel, we ain't talking about just the Jews. We're not talking about a piece of land. We're talking about both houses scattered all over the world and everything. But the symbolism is that even Israel will need to bow to the beast. Even Israel will need to worship this beast. And so I thought that was symbolic of the 70 nations, and then Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, renamed Israel, also having to worship this beast. Again, we won't bow, we won't worship. True Israel will not worship. But
I'll come back and describe that. We'll go back to an image where these women are encircling and worshiping this beast. Right after I show this part, I'll come back and I'll show you that. So this is the lead singer of Duran Duran right here. And notice what's happening behind him in the tower. These are angelic-like figures now flying through the tower. So we saw the coiled serpent. We have the all-seeing eye over the tower again. It's there now over the tower. And then you've got this lead singer of Duran Duran, and notice what's on his shirt. You see this?
Yeah.
This is intended to represent a knight. And I'm going to come back to why this issue of knighthood is significant after I address your question, Scott. But I want people to see, again, that in the background of all of this, you have that eye over the tower. And they're being very selective with their lyrics, what they sing. So notice this eye over the tower again. And the source, the bull is still facing it, and the beam of light is again going between the chest of the bull and this all-seeing eye over the tower. So that's what I wanted everyone to see. It's portraying the resurrection of the Babylonian Empire, the Tower of Babel and the Babylonian Empire. And in essence, a resurrection of Lucifer, if you will, with that star falling to the earth, being disseminated as a bunch of New Age kind of shards, if you will, being resurrected in the tower to be placed above it, and then all the nations worshiping, at the feet of this bull before the base of the tower, facing this all-seeing eye, when they're not facing this bull idol. All of this was done under Charles, who blessed the whole thing, who oversaw the whole thing. And now when we come back to, and I'll have to just jump through some of this imagery with these women worshiping this thing. And let me show Charles here at the beginning. So Charles at the beginning gets out of his Aston, I want to say Aston Martin, but that might not be right, his vehicle. He's got this fancy vehicle from the 70s that he was given actually right after he became formally invested as Prince of Wales. Still drives it. He converted it to run on biofuels produced by cheese and wine. Yeah, they made a big deal out of it here at the ceremony, which is why I'm mentioning it. So here he is with Camilla getting out of his vehicle, which he drove on to the track of the stadium, and now he's going up to the platform. This is where it all starts, and this is before the bull comes onto the stadium. So he's overseeing it from that point. And then when we get into the stuff with the bull, well, before that, let me show one other thing that happens at the tower. So there's a point at which where they show fire inside the tower, kind of like hell, like Dante's Inferno, if you will. They have their own explanation for what it is, but I view it as representing the fires of hell. And these New Age women, led by Stella, she's the black lady with the shard at the center of all of them, are going to perform another magical ceremony to put out the fires of hell, if you will. So that's what they're doing right here, to try to drive the fires from the tower. And there you go. So I thought that's another interesting aspect of the ceremony. And let's come to these women worshiping the bull, and I'll tell you what that's about to your question here, Scott. And there was a lot of sexual Satanism at this ceremony. It was interwoven throughout. And I won't go into the details here, but it was a big portion of the imagery and the symbolism apart from the worship of this bull. All right, so this bull is now coming onto the field right after it's broken free from the chains. And it's kind of stampeding in an angry fashion, and that's how they're portraying it in their narrative for the event. And
the British announcers were actually kind of funny.
Yeah. So right now it's supposed to be angry, and Stella is going to try to appease it with the Luciferian shard she's got. She's basically saying, we're here to be friends. We're here to worship you. We're not your enemies, kind of a thing. And so she's leading the charge, Stella for Stellar, the lead worshiper, if you will, of Lucifer. So these women behind, I call them the slavish women, but these moppish women who have been freed from their own burdens, if you will, are now behind this bull. And this is the beginning of the overt worship of this thing in the ceremony. Stella is the only one visible with a shard in her hand at this point. She's going to touch the thing's nose to appease it. They're all stretching forth their hands to it pretty quickly after this too. And worship, these moppish women are. You'll see them doing that fairly soon if I let it just keep playing. But I'm going to skip forward a little bit here. And now the bull is following them. Notice its color is no longer fiery red. It's changing. Show it's been appeased. Now these are the people. Some of these are actually the athletes. And they're dancing, dressed in these colors, doing these dances of their native territories and so forth. And they're it's like a rumble. They're facing off against each other. The various teams are, these colors of teams. And they're supposedly angering this bull, whatever, and now it's got to be appeased again. So now you've got all these dreamers. There's 72 of them. Stella is the 72nd. She's atop the bull. There's 71 encircling it. So, Scott, to your question, I pointed out in an interview with Janie Duvall earlier this year what's actually being intimated in all of this. So, once a year at Tabernacles, historically, in the Mosaic Law, Israel was to sacrifice various animals, and among them were 70 bulls. And the traditional understanding has been that they represented the nations. And there has been a suggestion by various preachers and folks over the centuries that the sacrifices were meant to be for the sin of the nations in some fashion at Tabernacles. I pointed out that that was not correct, that instead it was representing the Messiah as our high priest, slaughtering the nations who are worshipers of the devil, worshipers of the bull idol, if you will.
Worshippers of the other 70. I believe the ESV gets it right with that translation as opposed to King James and ASB. If anybody in the audience is listening to Heiser's teaching, Doug, you agree with that, right? That as far as the Deuteronomy passage that was in most translations, it says sons of Israel when they didn't exist at that time, that in all likelihood from the Dead Sea Scrolls and I think the Septuagint, it really should say sons of Elohim, like the fallen angels.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. Yeah, but Tim, go on. It's interesting. I'm liking this.
Okay. So
hey, Tim, by the way, neither one of us has ever been this quiet before, so you're right.
Well, let me again, you're a little quieter here. No, I'm kidding.
No. Again, we talked the other day, and I don't want to cut you off when you're doing presentations.
No,
like
it's
Go ahead,
fine, no problem. So what I'm saying is, Moses was overseeing this initially at Tabernacles at the beginning, and then later it was Israel's high priest, of course, overseeing it. They'd sacrifice 70 bulls each year at Tabernacles, understood to represent the nations, but people interpreting that subsequently would suggest that these were sacrifices for the sins of the nations, since they didn't know the real God yet, weren't worshiping the real God. I've come along and I've said, no, that's not a correct interpretation. What it's actually representing is the Lord terminating, sacrificing the nations who do not know him like they are brute beasts. And scripture says that man without understanding is like the beasts that perish. And there's a specific kind of a beast that it's representing. In other words, they're bull worshipers, they're Baal worshipers, they're Molech worshipers. And that's what's being suggested, being sacrificed. What's interesting here in this ceremony about the numbers, is that Stella being atop the bull, there's 71 surrounding her. It's basically suggesting that Israel, which came along after the 70 nations in Genesis 10, there were initially 70 nations around the original Tower of Babel. And in the Table of Nations, there were 70 nations that then spread out and formed the nations of the world post-flood, after Noah's flood. Israel came along subsequently, being called out of those nations, starting with Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob, the first to be named Israel. What they're suggesting here, I believe, in this imagery is that Israel is to be the 71st nation and is now to participate with the other nations of the world in worshiping the devil, worshiping Lucifer. And in this case, in this context, become Baal worshipers, with the Baal Molech bull idol. And quite interestingly, this year, on a slightly different note, you had potentially 5 red heifers transported to Israel. There have only supposedly been 9 in Israel's recorded history. And now suddenly this year, they've taken 5 of them from Texas to Israel. And we have to wait a few more months to see if, the first of them actually proves to be completely red still when it becomes 2 years and a day old. There's a time frame when they examine them to know if they're actual red heifers, so to speak, under the law of Moses. But bottom line is, you had that happen in conjunction with this event here in Birmingham right after it. And, of course, they would, I mean, they're cows, right? They're related in that sense, you know, these heifers. Anyway, the point is they're intimating that Israel joins the nations in worshiping this bull. And Charles, who I've said is the foretold Antichrist of Scripture based upon that imagery in Revelation 13, that he has it, based upon the name calculation, based on other things I haven't gotten into other than the statue, of course, which is interesting. We did look at that. The idol that exists to him already, that's to be put on the Temple Mount in the future. But the point is here, now you've got all these 71 dreamers who have their shards encircling this bull. They're bowing down to the thing, literally. And on the inner circle is these moppish women who are the initial individuals, you know, pulling this bull by chains, and it pulled itself free from the chains. They dropped the chains. Now they're all freed. The head plate is still on the bull because that's yet to be lifted off by these angels coming in. And notice the bull's eyes are crying blood red. This is supposed to be blood coming from the eyes of the bull, counterfeiting what Christ did in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's what's actually being portrayed here. Yeah, while they're worshiping this thing. And now Stella is beginning the New Age ceremony with these other dreamers, and she's moving her shard atop the bull in a specific way to actually invite the world and the audience to participate in this worship of the bull. It's very intentional. And she's going in all the directions. And you'll see that everyone gets involved who's surrounding the bull. Even the colorful dancers will continue their encircling until they also stretch their hands forward to the bull. So this whole worship is very satanic. And the audience is just sitting there watching it. But they are acknowledging the devil in this whole thing. And behind the bull in this case is the tower. So the bull isn't facing it. The tower is actually behind the bull for this. And here they go. They're coming to the head of the bull now. You see him flying across to remove the head plate from the top of the bull. The final symbol, if you will, in freeing it. So it's like they're saying they're unleashing the devil, basically, to the world. They're unleashing the worship of Lucifer to the world through this bull idol. They're taking off all the restraints. What's left? We didn't see it in this. I haven't shown it, but the chain, the bull pulled free from its restrainer, its chain at the beginning of this entry onto the field.
Tim, good question. What are the words written on this face of the bull?
I'd have to pull up my book to quote them, but basically they have to do with freedom. They're the names of some of the chain makers historically in Birmingham. There are specific phrases having to do that are demonic and satanic phrases as well, having to do with, you know, power, freedom, peace,
liberty,
that kind of stuff. Yeah, liberty is not one of the words, but yeah, power, peace, the
New World Order,
the
love,
snake, the serpent, the snake and the serpent are intimated on it also. Different things, but there are dozens of words and I don't know, several phrases that I took great pains to actually identify and quote in my book. And I don't know what they all are off the top of my head, but they go along with this New Age ceremony, basically, apart from the fact that
isn't the bull currently like in Birmingham, England now permanently?
Well, it's not designed to handle the weather. And so it's an open question whether they'll build some structure around it to protect it from the elements. You know, people want to preserve it. They did put it in an area in Birmingham, and I don't know if it's still there while they were debating whether to destroy the thing or permanently house it somewhere.
Well, if events keep converging and aligning, they're not going to have to worry about the weather for too much longer anyway. I mean,
right. That's right. So, you know, that's the thing that Charles oversaw. He oversaw basically enthroning the devil in a symbolic way to the world and suggesting that the world worshiped the bull and Lucifer, at a reconstructed, reconstructed Tower of Babel, Babylonian Empire, that kind of thing. It was all symbolically represented in a New Age ceremony. And he oversaw that.
Fantastic. That was really interesting.
Thank you. And there's something else.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm not quite convinced, not yet, that King Charles is the Antichrist. I'll keep my. I'll stay open to that. But what you did with all of this, this Baal stuff. I mean, that's mind numbing.
Let me paint a picture for you, Doug, before you go. If you have to go, let me state a couple of things quickly. So I've stated that Charles has been the #1 globalist in the world, including running the whole show today behind the scenes. The audience, many people in the audience will immediately recognize some of what I'm saying. So, and this is just one entity, folks. There are dozens under Charles. And I mentioned, for example, the League of Nations, the United Nations, and part of their connection to Charles. There's so much more. But almost everyone has heard of the Great Reset at this point. And under the Great Reset, to which most of the world's nations are signed on, including China through Xi Jinping, including Russia through Vladimir Putin, all the nations of Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., all of them. They're all signed on. They're all subservient to this Great Reset agenda through the World Economic Forum. Over the World Economic Forum is its founder, Klaus Schwab, who founded it in 1970. He's German. His father was a Nazi. He's a Rothschild by birth. He also is a Knight of Charles. Not a lot of people know that. He's a Knight of the British monarchy. He's actually a Knight of Charles. Klaus Schwab is. He has reported to Charles all these decades. He also wrote a book titled The Great Reset with a COVID subtitle. He announced it to the world, but it was not Schwab. It was Charles who announced the Great Reset to the world for the first time from the World Economic Forum months before Schwab unveiled his book or ever mentioned the phrase Great Reset. Also, that phrase Build Back Better, which is typically written in lowercase. The 3 B's represent 666 for Build Back Better. That phrase also comes from Charles and was used when he announced the Great Reset to the world. Bill Gates, who has been on a lot of people's tongues because of what has happened in the last 2+ years, also is a Knight of Charles and has been this whole time. A lot of these, top actors who are over these things that are happening in the world today are Knights of Charles. The rest are tied in under the World Economic Forum and other entities that Charles is overseeing. The whole Mideast, quote unquote, peace process sits beneath Charles. Today, when people look at that, they'll see the quartet. And the quartet is basically all the nations of the world because its 4th member is the United Nations. So the quartet is the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the UN. The quartet, the entire time it has existed, has been under Charles. Initially, it was Tony Blair, after he was Prime Minister of the UK, heading the quartet. Since then, it's been other members of the UK, under other subjects of Charles, let's put it that way, who have been heading the quartet. Even before that, you can trace it back to the London Agreement of 1987, which led to the Madrid Peace Conference, which led to the Oslo process and Oslo 1, 2, and 3, out of which came the quartet and the roadmap. All of that has been under Charles. The London Agreement of 1987 was initiated by Charles, and it was done under Shimon Peres and Jordan's former King Hussein, who was educated in London. Shimon Peres was a Knight of Charles. So that's just to paint a small piece of the picture that I lay out and document in the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea. And I wanted you to hear that, Doug, so that you understand a little bit of how Charles is running the show. What's happening in our world today with the collapse of the energy systems, trying to do this transition away from oil and gas and coal and so forth, is being directed under Charles, and it has been this whole time. They're collapsing the energy systems. That in turn will lead to a collapse of transportation and food production and systems, and also, of course, collapse of fertilizer.
I got a question, and again, Maria's coming on next week, everybody, and she is going to present, and I will agree with her on this. as far as the qualities, the personality traits. I'm amening Tim on what he's presented so far, but as far as the personality traits, and this is what Maria will be talking about. And again, Doug and I don't agree with Maria, but it'll be a fascinating discussion. The Trumpster fits the qualities and the personality traits of the little horn as described in Daniel much, much more than King Chucky. Would you agree?
I'm going to disagree.
No,
Let me tell you why. Let me tell you why.
Just as described, we don't talk over each other. I'm asking a question. Just as described in Daniel, would you not agree? And I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to lead you. Would you not agree that Trump's personality fits those traits much more so than Chuck?
Are you speaking of Daniel 11 or Daniel 7?
One where he is brash, he builds towers. Again, Maria can lay out a great case for Trump, and we'll do that next week.
Okay, but here's what I'm going to say. No, it's actually Charles who fits it much better. And in fact, the World Economic Forum is the perfect example of why he fits it better. So to the World Economic Forum, we literally see the world, the sovereign nations of the world, ceding their power right now. Canada's Justin Trudeau is a member of the WEF. Half of his whole cabinet is in the World Economic Forum under Charles, under Schwab. You see that happening all over the world, where the world is ceding their authority to Charles through the World Economic Forum to pursue the agenda he has laid out and Schwab under him has laid out.
What source?
Now, when we talk about
I got a question. I got a question. What source is it that you're saying Charles heads up? In other words, anybody listening live, anybody listening in the future, where could they go to actually read something credible that Charles is the leader of the World Economic Forum? And I'm not asking.
He's not the leader. He's over the leader of the World Economic Forum.
Okay, but where? Okay, I know you're saying that. Hold on, whoa. I know you're saying that.
Yep.
Prove it. How can it be proven?
It's documented with the sources in my book, in the second edition that'll be going to press this.
Again, you've been writing it for years. Where? I mean, where is it documented? Is what I'm asking.
Multiple sources, including statements from Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum.
Name the top two. I'm on a bold statement like that. I'm just asking for a source. Is all. That's all. I'm not.
Rather than naming it, I'll say go look up photos of Charles with Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum historically. He's been there at the front with Klaus Schwab in the photos from early on, and Klaus Schwab has been pursuing his agenda from the start, but Klaus Schwab has also been his knight all this time. So has Bill Gates for several years. The point is, and you can also look at the speeches given at the WEF, the things that Klaus Schwab said about Charles, and the things that Charles spoke independently of Schwab at the WEF. Those speeches are quoted in the second edition of the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, but they can be found also on YouTube if people hunt for them, where you can hear what Klaus Schwab is saying about Charles and so forth on YouTube. So that's what I will point people to, is to go do that due diligence. It's impossible for me to remember the titles of these YouTube videos, and there's so many of them. Again, but they're documented in the book.
I would be talking about
and you can hear people. You can hear it from the horses' mouths in the videos, and the text, of course, is quoted.
I would be talking about. I muted you. I would be talking about books, credible sources, biographers, anything to do with the World Economic Forum, where it actually shows that Charles heads up the World Economic Forum.
He's over it. He doesn't head it. He's over it. There's a difference. Schwab founded it and heads it. Charles is over Schwab. Schwab reports to Charles. That's the point I'm making. And the agenda that Schwab has driven through the World Economic Forum all this time is under Charles. Charles has personally spoken at the World Economic Forum as well, with Klaus Schwab and separately from him. And you can hear what they said about what Klaus Schwab said about Charles, and then what they both said at the forum. So in other words, you don't have to read a book for this stuff. Now I give the links and the sources in the book so people can go to the actual videos on YouTube, but I also quote them. So you can hear it directly from their mouths is what I'm saying. You don't have to go to some biographer's book, but I have put all that documentation together.
Let me ask you this. When is your book coming out?
Goes to press this month.
Okay.
So it'll take however long the printer needs to get it to the publisher to then ship to customers, but it can be ordered now. Worst case scenario, from what I'm told, is would put it at the end of June next year when it ships, only if it takes 6 months for the printer to print it and turn it around and get it into Prophecy House's hands to ship to customers. We're being told 3 to 6 months. We're looking for faster alternatives, but that's the time frame right now to do bulk printing for books.
Well, this has been incredibly interesting. Thank you, Tim. There's a few.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We went way over what we normally do, but there's let's see, a few questions that I wanted to.
Hey.
Yeah. So this is. Well, hold on. So this is from Brian. It says there are multiple names that equal 666. Maitreya, Lepetos, Nero, for it's one of the claims. And then he makes a follow-up comment. Gematria is a slippery slope. It shows things that aren't biblical as good depending on how we interpret it. I mean, Lucifer and Jesus are the same number, and no one is going to convince me that's good. So I would agree that I think Gematria is very unreliable, and what you showed about the whole thing of Birmingham, that was phenomenal. The thing about Gematria, I know. Look, I think a lot of Gematria is garbage in, garbage out, quite frankly. And
well, it is, but this isn't the typical Gematria, so I want to answer that.
I looked at it. I looked in your website, and the problem here is that there's no ch in Hebrew, right? There's a ts. All right, so it comes out it's Charles instead of Charles, right? So I don't think Charles is his name.
Well, again, that's based on the spelling in the press.
Well,
so you have to
transliterate.
You have to transliterate Charles,
but you can't,
and that's how they're representing it. Well,
no, I know.
Okay, you're right. But let me make 2 points on that. One is we're dealing with 2 different languages, really 3 when you include Greek. So the system to do the calculation is identified in the Greek text from which the English is translated. So in other words, the New Testament, the inspired New Testament, is originally in Greek. And now we, being English speakers, are typically reading from an English translation. If we go to the received text or the Textus Receptus or majority text, any of those, you'll find that in the Greek text, the number 666 is not written out in the form of Greek words. Instead, it's written with 3 Greek letters, 1 letter for 600, a second for 60, and a third for 6. The fact that it's given that way in the underlying Greek text and then they translate it into English as 666 actually identifies the system we're supposed to do the calculation on. Historically, that system was derived from the Hebrew language, which had 22 glyphs. Hebrew does, fewer characters than Greek and English, in other words. And the original Hebrew system cuts off at 400. They expanded it to include 500 through 900 in Greek, and then they included 600 as one of those 3 characters in the Greek text of Revelation 13:18. So it's a sequential system. The way that it was transferred to the Greek language historically by whomever did that, and I presume it was Israel's scribes probably in the 2nd century BC, I don't know, but whoever did it, that's what was later used in the inspired Greek text to identify the system to use. It was transferred sequentially, not phonetically, to the Greek, and that's a very important point. That means we can take the same system and we can transfer it sequentially. In other words, the original numbers of the original Hebrew system, we can transfer them sequentially to any language. And then we can do the calculation of a name or a word in that language natively without translation. If we're dealing with a name, we don't have to translate if it's in that language. So in this case, the title Charles, Prince of Wales or Prince Charles of Wales, it doesn't matter how you order the words or the letters. That title works out to exactly 666 using the original numbers transferred sequentially from the original Hebrew system, only we're doing it now to English. We're transferring it sequentially to English using the Greek version in the underlying Greek text of Revelation 13:18 as our precedent, as it were, our authority, if you will, to transfer the system sequentially to some other language, in this case English, and to calculate the title. But
I know what you're saying.
When we look at the Hebrew, where you do have to do some transliteration, the same title, Charles, Prince of Wales, that does require transliteration for the name Wales. It also requires it for the name Charles. Yes, right.
I mean,
so we're doing
there's a I think you have inherent problems that,
and I point that out.
It's interesting.
By the way.
It's interesting.
I do point that out in the book. That people can argue against the Hebrew on the basis of those sorts of issues, but then you still have the English. You still have the imagery on the coat of arms. You still have things that are statistically.
Wait a second. Wait a second. Tim, one second. So
yes, sir.
I'm giving you okay.
Okay.
I just think that there's some challenges there. So here's a guy, Blake. He says, Tim, your work and research is by far the most compelling work I've ever studied on the subject, and I thank you for doing so. So you definitely have some fans out there, and I'm glad that they were able to tune in. Well, let's say that you were absolutely right. Okay, so let's say that you're absolutely right. King Charles is the Antichrist, etc. So how long? I mean, when does the clock start ticking in, and when should we expect this thing to be over if he's the guy?
So there are three ways historically to look at this in terms of the time frame. And I'm going to pull up an image here just to put part of that in context. We can look at biblical chronology, and I believe Scott would agree with me on this, that biblically, history is 7 millennia long from the creation of Adam to the end of the millennial kingdom. That's what Israel scribes historically would have said, 6,000 years basically to the Sabbath millennium. A lot of early Christians would have agreed with that. That was the position of the ante-Nicene and even the post-Nicene church for quite a while, that history was 6,000 years from Adam to the start of the millennial kingdom. People went awry. Yeah, people went astray with that. They were looking for Christ's return in the 6th century AD, and it didn't happen. So you have this anticipation in the writing of the early church fathers that Christ's return wasn't that far in the future. The reason that they had that anticipation, and I wrote about this, Doug, in my upcoming Messiah History in the Tribulation Period series. So I actually circulated drafts of that in the early 1990s. It's not published yet. People can't get it. But even in the circulated drafts, I have a complete volume on biblical chronology. And in that, I pointed out that the chronology that the early church fathers, by the time you get to the 4th and 5th century AD, the chronology they were using was the one in the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And that chronology in the Septuagint is wrong. It's off by 1,500 years into the future, meaning when they were getting to the 4th and 5th century AD, the primarily Gentile church, which was following the Septuagint for the Old Testament rather than the original Hebrew Old Testament, they had an expectation that the year 6000 would be reached in the 6th century AD.
They didn't understand that last days meant literally the last 2 days of this age, the 5th and the 6th day. When the
I'm saying to you, they thought they were.
I know. Yeah, we're in agreement on this.
I'm just saying they thought they were 1,500 years closer than they were. And when we get to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, 1,000 years later, when there's an expectation that the eternal state's supposed to happen, the new heavens and the new earth and so forth, because they think they're at the end of the year 7,000, all of a sudden they're going back to the original biblical chronology in the Hebrew text. And now they're looking forward to what for us is basically around the year 2000. So you can approach it from the Hebrew chronology up to Christ's crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection.
Okay, so
up to
what's
today,
the
we're
answer?
nearing the year 6000. So
we're
that's
out
the
of
least.
time.
Yep,
I know
that's the least accurate.
So,
next accurate is a
wait a
covenant,
second,
a
Tim.
treaty.
Tim, we're out of time. So
okay.
We're way over time.
If we see war start with North Korea this year, before this year's over, or early in January, I would suggest we're in the second year of the tribulation week. If we don't, I don't think we're in that week yet.
Okay. I mean, what King Charles did at the Birmingham Games, was that the kickoff of something, in your opinion?
So it was 6 weeks after that his mother died and he became King Charles. In conjunction with those events, it became no longer possible to stop him, in my view. And
Okay.
I felt a change in the Holy Spirit with the Birmingham event before his mother died, basically indicating to me, and this is how I've taken it, that we've passed the threshold of where he can be stopped, humanly speaking. He's no longer prosecutable, for example, for any crime. As King of England, he has the wealth of the crown at his disposal, which people have argued in reality is in the tens of trillions with a T dollars, not the billions published in the press. He has certain capacities as monarch that he didn't have as Prince of Wales. I never actually thought he needed to become monarch, but he has. Regardless, when this thing with Birmingham happened, I believe that signified it's too late to stop him, and that means that we're heading toward the Great Tribulation, and I don't think it's probably that far off.
All right. Well, thank you. Wow, this has been
Thank you.
a fun show. I'm glad I could finally make it. I am sorry to everybody that my microphone wasn't working, but that's okay. We get to hear some great stuff from Tim. I'm still not quite convinced that King Charles is the Antichrist, but I thought it was a phenomenal presentation, and what Tim shared with us regarding the games, the Commonwealth Games, was incredibly interesting. So check that out. Make sure to share this with everyone. If you guys want to help support this ministry, you can just go right here, patreon.com/Doug Hamp. Give as little or as much as you want. Thank you. It really is a big help. Big shout out to the patrons already. So thank you, Scott. Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate you guys being here. And
Doug, if I may interject, people can find
please.
out about this material at prophecyhouse.com, my publisher. That's where they
prophecyhouse.com. All right,
yep,
prophecyhouse.com.
prophecyhouse.com.
All right, if you guys want to get a copy, please do. I think you'd enjoy it. All right, take care and good night.